She slammed the taxi door with a sound like a gunshot, the cheap paint catching flecks of the evening streetlight as the driver's eyes went from hopeful to stunned in the space of a single heartbeat. If that door had not closed, she might have missed the boardroom call that would decide her father's company fate, and if that video on a stranger's phone went viral, her whole life would tilt. Why had she called him broke under the yellow roof of that danfo? And how could one rejection carry the weight of a man's future? In that crushed moment she did not see the man's hands trembling as he pocketed the change or notice the small envelope he pressed into a child's palm. She only saw her reflection, sharp and entitled, and would later learn what paid pride costs when a hidden fortune walks back into your life. A horn answered from down the street, and a figure watched from the rain-dark alley with an unreadable face, then vanished into the night. Amina lived in the tidy orbit of Concord Fleet, the family company that ran the intercity buses from Oshodi to Lekki. She kept rules like neat files. Appearances mattered, contracts mattered. Her father's name mattered above all. She had learned to measure love in meetings, and to translate her nervousness into the blunt efficiency of email. She loved her little brother Ibrahim like a small secret, and worried for Father Musa when the cough dragged on into nights that smelled of generator smoke. She had told herself more than once that the man in the danfo was a problem to be closed, a poor, a nuisance, a moment to be denied. So when she rejected the broke driver, she thought the world would nod and move on. But the city keeps small injustices like hunger, and the boy in the back pocket of the danfo kept a camera that would not forget. Where pride was a currency, Amina's account was about to be overdrawn. Citing moms, Ant arrived with the cold efficiency of a headline. A short clip of Amina calling a driver broke and slamming a danfo door, uploaded to a trending feed, turned into a boardroom storm by breakfast. Concord Fleet's competitors smelled weakness, and an important municipal tender that came with years of guaranteed routes began to slip through their fingers. Amina felt the hot shame of the clip as if it were physical, a palm across her face. And she watched her father's hands tremble when he was asked on camera whether his company condoned his daughter's behavior. She had always believed that belonging to a name could bury a mistake, but the video showed her face on phones from the market at Agege to the mosque courtyard near their house, and every ring of her phone now carried knives. By the time the board demanded an explanation, the switch had been thrown and the consequences were visible. Loss of tender, loss of face, and the slow, certain tax of public scorn. Concord's losses were immediate and smellable. The red earth of the company yard turned to thick mud after a sudden rain. Oil-stained men stood with hands in pockets, and every generator hummed a worried refrain as buses idled with no contracts to carry them. Amina scrambled through apologies with journalists, rehearsed contrition in front of the mirror, and tried to stitch the damage with sponsored charity drives, but each patch tore when someone found the original clip and set it alight again. Debt notices arrived like uninvited relatives. Vendors who had given credit to the fleet's mechanics began to demand cash, and her father's phone filled with calls from angry shareholders. She gave away the little comforts she could, title dinners and silk scarves. But dignity was not something sold cheaply, and someone in the crowd kept pressing the question, who would stand to gain from Concord's fall? She turned to help and found a wolf in a fine suit. Mr. Eze came with a polished grin, a glossy business card, and promises of crisis PR that sounded like prayers. "Let me handle it," he said in the echoing hall of Concord's conference room, and Amina, hollow from sleepless nights and her father's pleading eyes, handed him access to their media channels. He arranged interviews, staged apologies, and took her credit for the ideas while asking for more and more control, each concession like sanding another layer off her backbone. Behind closed glass, he suggested a private settlement with the driver. "We can buy silence," he murmured, and Amina felt something cold in her throat when he mentioned quiet payments, cheap fixes for expensive problems. When she signed the first of the documents, the ink smelled like surrender, and later a recording appeared on a midnight feed that made it look as if the whole crisis had been a staged performance rather than a moment of public shame. Who was Ise really, and what exactly had she invited into their house? The pattern broke when the harmattan came, thin and dry like an old rumor through the city's lungs, and the story leapt across months like a single stubborn ember. The boardroom troubles became home troubles. The rent man stood at their gate in Surulere. The market women who had always given Ibrahim credit turned away when he reached for flour, and Father Musa's cough grew wet and heavy in the pre-dawn. Amina watched the meaning of consequences in the slow packing of their life into boxes, the way their kitchen cups rattled, and she felt every sharp thing she had said reflect back in the faces of people who had once called her daughter with pride. The city hummed. Danfo horns, market calls, a church bell from down the lane, while she tried to buy time with speeches and favors, and the more she negotiated, the less she recognized the person who had once slammed that taxi door. If this was the price of pride, she wondered, then who had paid it first? News of the potential strike by the driver unions arrived like a demand for blood. Drivers, long ignored, talked of walking off the job and bringing Concord's buses to a standstill during the tender decision week. Amina had to enter the open yard where drivers ate under tarpaulins with smoke from frying oil and the smell of brake dust in their hair, and she realized she had no language to reach them that wasn't soaked in apology. One man, Sani, smiled like a brother and promised support, buying her tea as if he were a friend, but his cell phone betrayed him. Within hours, a smear piece about Concord's elitist daughter had headlines, and Sani's voice quoted as a righteous leader calling for public humiliation. The betrayal stung sharp because Amina had felt it as kindness, Sani's tea, his firm handshake. But it turned out to be a mask for those who wanted to use her as a drum to beat the bigger danger of exploitation. What leverage did she have left when even the allies cost her dearly? In the moment before ruin, a small thing lit like a coin in a child's palm and promised a future repayment. Months before the clip, when Amina had been less hardened and still traveling the city on errands, the danfo had broken down by the market at Iyana Ipaja. A young driver had carried her little brother Ibrahim in his arms to the clinic after Ibrahim scraped his knee badly on the red earth. Amina, pressed for time, had slipped the driver a thin packet of cash and a sandwich and said, "Thank you." She barely remembered the driver's face among the hundreds of faces on Lagos afternoons, but Ibrahim remembered his kindness and tucked that memory like a small jewel. A tiny act, bread passed through a palm in the rain, comfort given without cameras, would later glint differently when seen by new, unexpected eyes, and Amina carried the warmth of that memory now like a lantern because it was the only pure thing left to illuminate her choices. The pressure compressed like a vice. 3 days to the final tender bid, 1 week before the bank could call in a loan on the Concord yard, and by dawn on the second day, Father Musa would need a surgical deposit, otherwise the hospital would discharge him into a street that would not be kind. The city's timetable ate at the family like termites. Creditors circled, investors whispered, and the board suggested they manage the narrative with evasions that tasted like lies. Amina found herself reading terms at midnight that asked her to consent to quiet settlements, to retract apologies, to falsify an internal report in exchange for a sliver of mercy. The consequences were concrete: loss of home, loss of health care, loss of reputation measured in blood and rent money. Every phone call was an ultimatum, and she began to understand that the map of her life was being redrawn by people who measured success in other people's humiliation. At the hard midpoint, the man in the danfo walked into the Concord foyer under electric lights and a corporate logo. He stood taller than the memory, his clothes cut to a different continent, and his shoes not the patched things of the Jerry market, and Amina recognized the curve of a jaw she had once judged. He smiled without triumph. Tunde, the driver she had refused, had returned not as a supplicant, but as a titan. Tunde Adeyemi, whose name now belonged to a new company with investors whispering in Mandarin and English, whose buses were already being booked for the very tender Concorde feared losing. She watched him from behind a glass wall, heart a drum in her ribs, and the world fractured into before and after. Whatever had been salvageable of her life would now be offered at the scale of his discretion, and every choice would be reframed by the fact that he could buy the very fleet that had been her birthright. Amina's stomach dropped. Could she ask forgiveness when the person she had wronged now held every lever? Darkness gathered when the board, desperate, offered Amina a choice that smelled of compromise: sign a statement that would smear Tunde as a litigious opportunist and the company would be saved, father's surgery paid for, the house kept, deny the truth, preserve their world. Amina sat in the cold of her apartment, watching Harmattan dust line the window, and felt the old pride urge her to accept the quick remedy. But the small lantern of memory, bread passed to a driver, Ibrahim's gentle insistence that kindness matters, glowed warmer. She could imagine the cascade of collaterals: a man ruined to save a name, a child learning that money buys silence. The seed of kindness she had once seen, and the shame she carried for the slammed door, yanked her toward a harder honesty. In the quiet she made her choice. She would not trade truth for comfort. She would not build her life on another's erasure. The climax arrived without fanfare, but with the absolute clarity of law and witness. Amina released the raw video of the board's meeting, including the moments Mr. Ease suggested blackmail and the staged apologies, and she made a public confession of her behavior in the danfo, of her role in silencing witnesses, and of the pressure placed on the drivers. The city watched as documents, phone records, and cash receipts were displayed like evidence on a market stall. Tunde, with a face carved by having watched the city's cruelty, paid no vengeful tribute, but used his new muscle to expose the corrupt contracts Eze had brokered and to offer contracts that would protect driver rights. Mr. Easy found his phone ringing less and his inbox full of subpoenas, and the union leader Sani was called to account when his recorded betrayal of the driver's trust surfaced. The consequence landed like a closing of a door. Eze resigned and later faced an inquiry, the smear campaign unraveled, and the board had to answer to new regulators whose patience was thinned by righteous public anger. Justice, visible and procedural, fell across the chapter like rain on a dry field. After storms, the city rearranges itself into new light. Concord Fleet was bought, not to exile her family, but to reform it. Tunde's company purchased the fleet with conditions that prioritized drivers' welfare and community investment, and he offered Amina a role to help rebuild trust and design a program that would put shares into the hands of the workers and scholarships into the hands of their children. Amina's father received the surgical deposit. His cough began to ease under the attentions of a surgeon from a nearby teaching hospital, and the house in Surulere that had been boxed and ready for sale was repaired with new hinges paid by a check that bore Tunde's name with no flourish. The market vendors who once refused, Ibrahim's hand now laughed with him as he apprenticed to an electrician on the new fleet's charging stations. And the red earth outside the depot showed fresh tracks where old buses had been replaced by cleaner, brighter vehicles. Danfo horns had not disappeared, but they sounded different now, part of a greener, fairer chorus rather than a ragged plea. In the new normal, the difference between rich and poor remained visible. The refurbished buses gleamed where old dents had once been, the choir in the mosque courtyard sang with more confident throats, and Concord's boardroom learned a vocabulary of listening. But the gap had been narrowed by choice and policy that put dignity before decadence. Amina woke each morning with the weight of her mistake still light in her chest, but it no longer defined her. She walked past the depot and saw drivers she had once feared and now greeted by name, and she took pleasure in small, reparative tasks, helping a driver arrange medical care, sitting in a mosque courtyard to ask forgiveness, overseeing a fund for children's uniforms. The city's sounds remained. Generators hummed, markets shouted, danfo horns broke the air, but now they played against a city that had chosen repair over ruin, and Amina felt the rare, steady peace of someone who had faced a moral reckoning and chosen a costly but honest path. Kindness is not a ledger that balances on the day it is given. It is a seed that waits, often unseen, until the right season for fruit. Truth is slow, and it hurts more at first than clever lies that buy comfort, but it is the only foundation that will hold when the storms come. Never judge a life by one chapter. The next page may belong to the person you thought was powerless. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments what choice you would have made and why. Subscribe for more folktales from across the continent. Like and share to bring these lessons to others, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story that walks in from the rain. Because the next chapter will test whether money can stay quiet when justice is loud, and whether kindness, once planted, can teach a city to harvest honestly. 2 weeks later, Lagos woke with a different rhythm. The circle of a people and a man who had begun as strangers finding a way to ride together toward a dawn where ownership, accountability, and care finally began to look like the same road. Yet the morning carried a new question, because dawn had not erased the old ache of secrets. In the steel-blue light of Surulere's streets, the first new buses hummed like a chorus of honest promises, while a careful whisper traveled from the yard to the market stalls. Who really pays for fairness when the city is too hungry to wait? By mid-morning, a courier in a neat suit arrived at Concord's new glass front, carrying a sealed envelope stamped with the Rising Sun Foundation's crest. A second, anonymous missive was slipped under the door of Amina's apartment. Both promised sunlight if she would attend a town hall of questions where every driver, every mother who sold fish at the market, and every student who studied by the thin light of a shared lamp could speak and be heard, a scene that felt like a rebirth and a threat at the same time. The open audit schedule went live on a public portal, and the first page listed the names of dozens who would be ready to testify, from the yard's eldest hands to the fresh recruits who wore the new badges like talismans. If the old guard had hoped to erode the reforms with whispers and shadows, the city's eyes were turning toward transparency. The words that fluttered through the corridors, accountability, governance, workers' ownership, public reporting, sounded less like slogans and more like a shared promise. Amina stood at the edge of the yard, feeling the soft heat of the sun on her face and the weight of yesterday's new truth pressing on her shoulders. She watched Ibrahim, now a sturdy apprentice under the fleet's new technicians, fix a bracket on a charger with the patient pride of a child who had learned to trust a road that did not punish him for his father's mistakes. She thought of the bread and sandwich tucked away in the danfo driver's memory, the way small kindnesses could sprout into robust trees when given room to grow. The old guard's shadowy hints and the Foundation's insistence on public accountability began to take shape as a real challenge, not a public relations stunt. A shadow critic group posted a live feed from the town hall, insisting that this reform was merely a cover for a new hierarchy. Another feed cut in with a flyer for a rival plan that claimed to restructure Concord into a more efficient machine that would not tolerate unearned risk. In the midst of the noise, Tunde appeared, not with a cape, but with a calm that rested on a lifetime of learning to ride through storms. He spoke in a voice that could fill a square and still leave room for nuance, saying that this was not a coup against the city's needs, but a partnership built on a shared ledger of lives improved. This silenced some critics and emboldened others who had long doubted the sincerity of wealth used for repair rather than to rise above. The turning point came when a junior auditor from the foundation stepped up with a stack of receipts and a clean, unglossed calendar showing quarterly driver checks, hospital subsidies, and scholarship disbursements that lined up with the testimonials from the yard. Then a document surfaced in the open portal, a previously private memo from a former executive that laid out a plan to transpose leadership into a more centralized, cost-saving framework under the guise of efficiency. It was a plan that would have cut driver ownership and dampened the very heart of the reform. Its language was clipped and precise, its tone harmless sounding, but its math was dangerous. Amina felt the old fear ripple through her again, the fear that power loves to hide in numbers, and good intentions can be dressed as mercy, while quietly shrinking the people it is meant to lift. Yet, before despair could take root, she noticed how the crowd around her shifted from caution to courage. Drivers, mothers, students, and clerks spoke up in rapid succession, their voices rough with sleep and bright with conviction, testifying to the real costs of neglect and the real gifts of accountability. In that chorus, Tunde's eyes met hers with a mutual understanding that the road ahead required not certainty, but courage to face discomfort together. Close to the forum's end, a familiar silhouette slid through the doorway, the anonymous donor's representative, a man whose calmness suggested he had counted the cost of every risk. He announced the foundation would not tolerate coercion, would publish every line item, and would appoint a rotating panel of drivers to oversee expenditures, a living budget that could bend to the city's needs and still hold a mirror to those who profited from keeping power quiet. When he added that the foundation's sunrise would endure only if the people themselves kept watch, Amin felt a strange relief. It was the sense that the wealth gap could be addressed without erasing the dignity of the poor and without letting fear govern the future. The open forum closed with a pledge. Driver ownership would be expanded, a first-year report would be posted online with plain language explanations, and the scholarship fund would begin to accept applications from all districts, not just the centralized hubs, so Ibrahim's future would be braided with the futures of others across Lagos. The crowd dispersed like a rainstorm breaking into sunlight, and in the sudden quiet, Amina walked with Tunde toward the fleet yard's new shade of green, where the hum of engines blended with the soft, steady murmur of conversations that promised a harvest of fairness if they kept the discipline of honesty. Yet even as the day's attention shifted toward logistics and voices, a quiet, stubborn thread remained. The old guard's promise to uncover any misstep and the whispered question of whether a single, unseen hand could still pull strings in the dark. While the town hall had restrained the worst impulses of power, the city's memory, like the memory of bread given in rain, would keep the ledger honest only if the people continued to demand it. As the sun slid toward the west, the last two conversations of the day found Amina alone on the depot steps. She listened to a driver recount the night the danfo had broken down by the market, and how a stranger's quiet act of kindness, shared bread, a relieved child, a nod of gratitude, had sparked a memory that kept faith alive when fear would have eaten it up. The memory pulled her toward a future where truth was not a weapon, but a doorway through which many could walk together. When she finally looked up, she saw the silhouette of the man who would not let this dawn be only a moment, not a flash in the pan, but a lasting measure of a city learning to balance power with mercy. As they walked back into the yard, the whisper of a new phrase traveled between them like a shared breath. We own it together. That ownership would be tested not by the brilliance of a single act, but by the steadiness of many days of listening, serving, and keeping faith with the people who rode the buses, the workers who kept the yard awake, and the children who would one day chart a map of Lagos that could never be erased by a single misstep or a hidden escape route for old fear. The interval beat had delivered its question, and now the first true answer would be measured in lives changed, not headlines won, in the patient, ongoing work of turning wealth into a daily instrument of repair. As night fell over a city where the lights glowed softly through zinc roofs and glass towers alike, Amina spoke softly to herself and to the night. Truth first, always truth first. For only truth could keep the road open for all who rode it, and only mercy could keep a future from erasing the past. If this chapter moved you, tell us in the comments what choice you would have made and why. Subscribe for more folk tales from across the continent. Like and share to bring these lessons to others, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story that walks in from the rain, because the next chapter will test whether money can stay quiet when justice is loud, and whether kindness, once planted, can teach a city to harvest honestly. The last bus of the night rolled out of the depot. The city seemed to lean forward a little, listening for the sound of a door that would close softly behind fear, and a door that would open wide enough for everyone to walk through together.